about it, mass incarceration, obviously impacts Black and brown people in so many ways. But in one of the ways, while Black and brown folks are in jail, they are actually being counted, right? So like during the census, they are being counted in the prisons where they're being incarcerated and not in their home jurisdictions. And so then, representational dollars are going to be going to those districts where people are being incarcerated. And a lot of the times prisons are also in predominantly white or more rural areas. So you have all of these federal dollars, right, going to these districts where people don't actually live, right? Exactly. And so their votes are actually being, and then when they do vote, their votes being diluted.
The massive effects that disenfranchisement can have, or even policies that are not overtly discriminatory, but more sophisticated in their discrimination. Briefly touching back on the Crawford case, but basically Crawford v. Marion County Election Board was a case in 2008 regarding an Indiana law regarding voter IDs. And the ruling in that case was so interesting and applicable to what we're talking about now, because it says that a policy must be both discriminatory in intent and effect to be labeled as discriminatory. And that in and of itself is problematic, because no policy is going to come out and say, oh, we are being discriminatory against Black people or elderly or young people who don't have voting IDs. But just the notion that they would have to be discriminatory from the outset, like saying in intent that they are so, is very problematic and relates heavily to what we're talking about in regards to the sophisticated discrimination. And because you were talking about this intersection of multiple different kinds of suppression, I wanted to maybe shift gears a little and talk about how voter suppression relates to other work of the LDF, maybe in criminal justice, as we've discussed earlier, but also
voter
economic justice,
political
education, how in those sectors voter suppression
intersects with every issue
or manifests
that we're talking
itself.
about, right? So starting with education, right? Schools are still incredibly segregated, right? Even though Brown versus Board was passed more than half a century ago, right? A school board could decide, we're going to take these drastic measures to just desegregate. We're going to bus the white kids this time, right? Or we're going to fund, right? If schools are predominantly Black and brown, the issue isn't that they're Black and brown, it's rather the issue is that there flows from that a denial of resources, right? And the resources go to the white schools. Because there are culturally affirming institutions, right? There are HBCUs, and those are incredibly important. And there are culturally affirming K-12 schools. School boards make these decisions. And so you can be voting for people on your school board, right? So it's a lot about these down ballot issues. Who gets voted onto a school board? These kinds of elections get decided sometimes by the hundreds of, right? Hundreds. On that scale, denying the vote to even a handful of people has a huge impact, right? And so then when you are disenfranchising, as in Florida, right, over 700,000 people, initially it was over 1 million people were going to regain the right to vote in Florida after Amendment 4, right? And so this poll tax prevented that many people from voting statewide. Imagine the impact on down ballot issues, right, in the specific counties or cities that people live in. And if everybody who is a citizen of voting age could vote without voter suppression, there could just be truly radical change, right? If you can imagine it. But when Black folks or brown folks are being carved out of that electoral process, then you're probably candidates or electoral officials who aren't serving your interests. You can't then vote them out, right? Because you're not a part of that system. When it comes to policing, right, defunding the police, right, has been a huge part of the conversation this summer. And you can also create change through protests, right? After the summer in New York, one of the most secretive laws, 50A, which was used to prevent the disclosure of police records, that was repealed because of protest. So there are ways to enact change without necessarily having to vote on that change. You know, if there are electoral officials who, you know, just aren't committing to defunding the police, to, you know, any number of things, and you're not able to vote them out of the office, then, you know, it becomes really difficult to enact the kinds of change that you want to see.
People see the prison system as completely separate from voting, voter rights, and things like that, when in reality you have so many things in between them that connect them to each other, such as the disenfranchisement of people who have experienced incarceration. We've talked about different ways in which these subtle forms of oppression function to restrict the power of Black and Brown communities, from voter ID to, you know, the prison industrial complex, to mail-in ballots, and so many other things. How do you work within the law to change some of these barriers? How do you, as a civil rights lawyer, work within the legal institution, which is like traditionally a restrictive, conservative institution, and how do you combat these different mechanisms that perpetuate institutional racism?
It is an inherently kind of conservative institution. It upholds structures. It is slow, you know, and so how and why, right? Like, how and why do I work within the law to try and enact change? I mean, I think it is incredibly important to hold the line, right? And also to be following the lead, right, of social movements, and organizers are usually like pushing, right? And really moving for a future that is just, you know, and that movement lawyering is incredibly important, right? Like paying attention to what organizers are actually doing and making sure that you're not at cross purposes, right? And so that you can be taking steps that minimize harm and that reduce harm, and that make it easier, right, for the organizers to then keep dreaming even more, right? So like once you've secured a floor, right, like you cannot do this anymore, right? Like then the organizers can dream of the next step, and then we would probably secure that next floor.
Just talking about how it is a collaborative effort between grassroots movements and organizers and those working within the legal system, whether as attorneys or counsel on the LDF. I think it is really interesting that you talk about how conservative the legal system is inherently and how incremental the process is of like accept or getting the legal system to adjust and adapt to the changing social times. But something else that we wanted to ask was, because this is such a collaborative effort, how does the LDF sort of interact with other groups like, I know the Equal Justice Initiative and, well, across America, but particularly in the South, because that is where some of these examples of disenfranchisement are most prevalent.
And I'm glad that you
so yeah, what is the interaction like, if there is any at all?
Because for LDF, right, we serve Black people. We're fighting anti-Black oppression in this country, and most Black people in the United States still live in the South. LDF is in New York and DC, but we have been litigating for our entire 80 years in the South, right? And we have been working, so for example, for me, I know the president of the Alabama NAACP very well because they, you know, are repeatedly fighting for the rights of Black folks in Alabama, and have been, they were one of our plaintiff organizations in this, in the COVID absentee voting case. But they were also our plaintiff in the photo ID law challenge, right? And so we're also working with Greater Birmingham Ministries, which has been in the fight since the civil rights era, right, in Birmingham. And that's another thing that's important to point out, right? Like the statutes that we got from the civil rights movement, I mean, those things came from Black and brown organizers in the South, right? And so it's not surprising then, nor should it be, that a lot of the organizing that we're seeing now, right, is coming from Black folks in the South. So on that point, right, Black voters matter. They were another one of our clients in this absentee litigation. And, with Georgia, a lot of folks were talking about Stacey Abrams and organizers. One of those folks, Latasha Brown, is one of the co-founders. Cliff Albright is one of the co-founders of Black Voters Matter. So with NAACP, they have chapters, right? Ask them what's going on. In Mississippi, right, we work with One Voice, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Like, these are the places where we're predominantly working, listening to the people who actually have to live there, right? Folks who have to live and live every day with the work that we do, right? So they have to be satisfied because they're going to live with the outcomes of the cases that we bring.
I really like the description that you gave, like following the lead of the people who have to live in these communities and who want to, make their own communities a better place. Especially because, so often there are a bunch of other places, a bunch of other like organizations or like approach this work very differently. So it's nice to hear that, you guys really take in the voice of the community and follow their lead, especially, working closely with community organizers in the South. We've really enjoyed having you on this episode. I think you've shared really insightful things, not only about voter suppression, but just about different forms of institutional racism that exist, from the census to the prison system. As a next step, like, what can the KS fam do to either get involved or take action in some way against voter suppression, or whether it be signing up to Canvas or anyone who wants to become a future lawyer or something? What advice would you have for our KS fam?
I definitely think canvassing and voting is important, but I'm not about to shame anybody into voting, right? I understand that there are real critiques. And to that I say vote and, right? I think that the and is really important. I think just kind of like with the law, voting is for holding the line, right? But then also for holding people accountable, right? Especially when it comes to voting people out, right? I think almost more than voting people in, voting people out, right? If they're not serving your interests. But the and, I think, is incredibly important. Like, organize, informed, like stay informed in your community. For example, city budget hearings happen, right? And if only people are going who want to keep funding the police, right? Or if only people of a certain viewpoint show up, then that's what city councilors are going to be hearing, right? So show up to those meetings, learn how that budgetary process works, right? Like, to them, annoying voice in the room, right? Like, be the persistent voice in the room. But at the same time, like, that is as important as showing up to protest, right? But then also just local elections are a lot of the times more important than federal elections, because those are what actually impact your community the most directly. So one of my dear friends and a former LDFer just got elected as a judge in New Orleans, right? And she was a public defender. She worked for the ACLU National Prison Project. She worked for LDS. She is a Black woman who's in her 30s, right? And she's now a judge in New Orleans. And those, she's a criminal judge she's a criminal judge for Section L now. And what that means is she's a trial judge. She's going to oversee trials of actual people, right? And a lot of the time, prosecutors are elected into these positions. The person who